Everyone told Vanessa she'd never amount to anything because she was just a poor orphan girl. But what they didn't know was that the blind beggar they forced her to marry was actually hiding a secret that would change everything. This is the story of how a girl who lost everything discovered she was worth more than she ever imagined. Vanessa's fingers were already bleeding, but Angela wasn't done with her yet. The 16-year-old girl knelt on the cold kitchen floor, scrubbing the same spot over and over while her stepmother stood above her with arms crossed and a look of pure disgust on her face. The house that should have been Vanessa's home felt more like a prison, and Angela was the warden who seemed to take pleasure in making every day a living nightmare. "You missed a spot," Angela said, pointing to an area that Vanessa had already cleaned 3 times. "Do it again, and this time do it right." Vanessa bit her lip to keep from crying out as she pressed the rough brush against the floor. The cleaning solution stung her open wounds, but she'd learned long ago that showing pain only made Angela angrier. Behind her, she could hear her stepsisters Mira and Sandra laughing as they painted their nails and talked about the boys they wanted to impress at the market. This wasn't the life Vanessa's father had planned for her when he remarried Angela 5 years ago. Back then, Vanessa still remembered what it felt like to be loved, to have someone who cared whether she was hungry or hurt or happy. Her father had been a kind man who worked hard to provide for his family, and when Vanessa's mother died in childbirth, he'd done his best to be both parents to his little girl. David Okafor had been a carpenter with steady work and a reputation for honest dealings. He built cabinets for the wealthy families in town and repaired furniture for anyone who could afford his services. Their small house on Maple Street wasn't fancy, but it was filled with love and the smell of fresh wood shavings that clung to his work clothes. Every evening, he would come home tired but smiling, always bringing little gifts for Vanessa. A smooth piece of cedar he'd carved into a small animal, wildflowers he'd picked on his walk home, or sometimes a sweet treat from the bakery when he'd had a particularly good day. Vanessa treasured those memories now, holding them close during the darkest moments of her current life. She remembered how her father would lift her onto his shoulders and carry her around the house, pretending she was flying like a bird. She remembered the bedtime stories he would tell, always featuring a brave little girl who overcame impossible odds through kindness and courage. Most of all, she remembered the way he would look at her like she was the most precious thing in the world, like her very existence made his life complete. But everything changed when Angela came into their lives. At first, she'd seemed like an answer to prayer, a widow with 2 daughters of her own who understood the challenges of raising children alone. She was beautiful in a sharp, calculated way, with perfectly styled hair and clothes that were always immaculate. When she smiled at David, he seemed to light up in a way that Vanessa hadn't seen since her mother's death. Angela brought gifts for Vanessa during their courtship, pretty dresses, hair ribbons, even a porcelain doll that Vanessa treasured for months. She promised to be the mother Vanessa had never had, to teach her all the things that only a woman could pass down to a daughter. She spoke of the wonderful family they would create together, how Vanessa would finally have sisters to play with and share secrets with. Vanessa had been so desperate for a family that she'd overlooked the warning signs that seemed obvious now. The way Angela's smile never quite reached her eyes when she looked at her. The subtle comments about Vanessa's table manners, or the way she wore her hair. The way Angela's daughters, Mira and Sandra, would whisper and giggle when they thought Vanessa couldn't hear them, already establishing a hierarchy that put her at the bottom. The transformation began slowly, right after the wedding ceremony. Angela would make small comments about Vanessa's appearance, her manners, the way she talked or walked or breathed. Nothing major at first, just little corrections that made Vanessa feel like she was constantly doing something wrong. "Sweetie, you shouldn't slouch like that. It makes you look common. Darling, perhaps you could speak more softly. Loud voices are so unladylike. Oh, honey, that dress makes you look so pale. Maybe we should find you something more flattering." Her father, who was working longer hours to support his expanded family, didn't notice the subtle cruelty that happened when he wasn't around. He was so grateful to have found love again, so happy to see his daughter with what appeared to be a caring stepmother and 2 older sisters, that he missed the signs of a psychological warfare being waged in his own home. David had always been a trusting man who saw the best in people, and Angela was skilled at presenting herself as the perfect wife and stepmother when he was present. She would fuss over Vanessa's appearance and education in ways that seemed loving to an outside observer, while delivering criticism that slowly eroded the girl's self-confidence. "David, I'm so worried about Vanessa's future," Angela would say over dinner, her voice dripping with false concern. "She's such a sweet girl, but she needs so much work if she's going to find a good husband someday. I've been trying to teach her proper deportment, but it's challenging when she's so set in her ways." Vanessa would sit at the table feeling like she was being dissected, analyzed for flaws that she didn't even know she possessed. Angela had a gift for making criticism sound like care, for presenting her attacks as loving guidance that only a true mother would provide. The real cruelty began when Vanessa's father got sick. It started with a cough that wouldn't go away, then fatigue that left him barely able to work. He would come home from job sites early, his face gray with exhaustion, apologizing for not being able to provide the way he used to. The medical bills piled up quickly, eating through their small savings and forcing them to sell possessions just to pay for treatments. Doctor visits became a weekly expense that stretched their budget to the breaking point. David tried to continue working, but his strength was failing, and customers began to complain about delays and shoddy workmanship. Angela complained constantly about the cost, making it clear that she saw Vanessa's father as a burden rather than a husband who needed care. "I didn't sign up to be a nurse," Angela would mutter as she grudgingly brought David his medicine. "I married a provider, not an invalid who can't even support his family." Vanessa tried to help by taking on more household chores, cooking meals when Angela claimed she was too stressed to manage, and even attempting to help her father with small carpentry projects when he felt up to working. But her efforts were met with criticism and resentment from Angela, who seemed to interpret any kindness Vanessa showed her father as a personal attack. "Stop babying him," Angela would snap when she caught Vanessa bringing her father tea or fluffing his pillows. "He needs to toughen up and get back to work, not be coddled like a child." But David's condition continued to deteriorate despite the expensive treatments and medications. What had started as a persistent cough developed into something more serious, something that left him struggling to breathe and too weak to leave his bed for days at a time. The doctors spoke in hushed tones about tests and specialists, about treatments that might help but couldn't guarantee a cure. During those final months, Vanessa spent every free moment at her father's bedside, reading to him from his favorite books and listening to his stories about her mother. He would tell her about the day she was born, how he'd held her tiny hand and promised to always protect her. He spoke about her mother's dreams for their daughter, the hopes and plans that had been cut short by tragedy but lived on in his heart. "You're so much like her," he would whisper, his voice weak but filled with love. "She would be so proud of the young woman you're becoming. You have her kindness, her strength, her beautiful spirit that no one can ever take away from you." These conversations became more precious to Vanessa as she realized that her father's time was running out. She treasured every word, every smile, every moment when his eyes would light up with the old warmth she remembered from her childhood. Even in his illness, he tried to be strong for her, to prepare her for a future he wouldn't be there to share. When he died 6 months later, 11-year-old Vanessa learned what it meant to be truly alone in the world. The funeral was small and cheap, with Angela making a show of grief that fooled the neighbors but didn't last past the cemetery gates. She wore an elaborate black dress and veil, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief and accepting condolences with dramatic sighs about how difficult it would be to raise 3 girls alone. But Vanessa could see through the performance, could tell that Angela's tears were for show rather than genuine sorrow. The woman had barely tolerated David when he was healthy and earning money. Now that he was gone, leaving behind only debts and responsibilities, Angela's true feelings were becoming harder to hide. By the time they returned home from the cemetery, Angela's mask had completely fallen away, revealing the cold, calculating woman who saw Vanessa as nothing more than free labor. The transformation was so complete and sudden that Vanessa felt like she was living with a stranger, someone who bore no resemblance to the caring stepmother who had courted her father's attention. "Your father left us with nothing but debts," Angela had said that first night after the funeral, standing in the doorway of what had been Vanessa's bedroom. Her voice was flat and businesslike, devoid of any pretense of warmth or sympathy. "You're going to have to earn your keep around here. This room is too big for a servant. You can sleep in the closet under the stairs." Vanessa had protested, had cried, had begged to keep the room where her father used to read her bedtime stories and tuck her in each night. The room still smelled like his aftershave and contained all her most precious possessions, the wooden animals he'd carved for her, books they'd read together, the few photographs of her mother that she treasured above everything else. But Angela's mind was made up, and Mira and Sandra were already moving their things into the larger space, giggling about having more room for their clothes and makeup. They treated Vanessa's loss like their gain, showing no sympathy for the grief-stricken girl who was watching her whole world disappear. "Don't be such a baby," Mira had said as Vanessa gathered her belongings with trembling hands. "It's just a room. You should be grateful you have anywhere to sleep at all. Besides," Sandra added with a cruel smile, "servants don't need fancy bedrooms. You'll be too tired from working to spend much time in there anyway." From that day forward, Vanessa's world shrank to a tiny, dark closet that smelled of mothballs and old shoes. The space was barely large enough for a narrow cot and a small wooden crate where she kept her few remaining possessions. There was no window, no fresh air, no natural light to brighten the oppressive darkness that became her new reality. The years that followed blurred together in a haze of endless work and constant criticism. Vanessa cooked every meal from scratch, often starting before dawn to have breakfast ready when the others woke up. She cleaned every room in the house daily, scrubbing floors until they gleamed and dusting furniture that seemed to collect dirt the moment she finished. She washed and ironed every piece of clothing, mended tiers and replaced buttons, and maintained the garden that provided vegetables for their meals. Angela made sure she understood that she was lucky to have a roof over her head at all, that any other woman would have thrown an orphan out on the streets to fend for herself. "I could have sent you to an orphanage," Angela would remind her regularly. "But I chose to keep you here out of the goodness of my heart. The least you can do is show some gratitude." But there was no kindness in Angela's decision to keep Vanessa. The girl was valuable as unpaid labor, someone who could maintain the household while Angela and her daughters lived lives of relative leisure. Vanessa's presence also allowed Angela to present herself to the community as a charitable woman who had taken in her husband's orphan child, earning her social credit while hiding the reality of how that child was actually treated. Mira and Sandra, who were now 18 and 19, treated Vanessa like their personal servant rather than their stepsister. They would mess up rooms just after she'd cleaned them, spill things on purpose to create more work, and make impossible demands just to watch her scramble to fulfill them. They wore beautiful clothes that Vanessa had to wash and iron with painstaking care, ate delicious food that Vanessa had to cook but was rarely allowed to enjoy, and lived lives of leisure while Vanessa worked from dawn until midnight. The sisters took particular pleasure in reminding Vanessa of her place in the household hierarchy. They would order her around in front of their friends, making sure everyone understood that she was not their equal but rather their servant. When visitors came to the house, Vanessa was expected to serve refreshments and then disappear, becoming invisible while the real family entertained their guests. "Vanessa, bring us some tea," Sandra would command when her friends visited. "And make sure the cups are properly warmed this time. Last week you embarrassed us with cold china. And don't forget the good cookies," Mira would add. "The ones from the bakery, not those awful things you tried to make last time." Vanessa would comply with these demands quietly, understanding that any protest would only result in additional punishment and humiliation. She had learned to move through the house like a ghost, efficient and unobtrusive, completing her tasks without drawing attention to herself or giving anyone reason to criticize her performance. The worst part wasn't the physical exhaustion or even the constant hunger from eating only scraps and leftovers. The worst part was the way they made her feel invisible, worthless, like she was less than human. Angela would introduce her to neighbors as the help, rather than her stepdaughter, erasing any connection to the family she had once belonged to. Mira and Sandra would talk about her as if she wasn't in the room, discussing her appearance and intelligence in terms that made it clear they saw her as fundamentally inferior to themselves. "Look at her hands," Sandra would say while Vanessa served dinner. "So rough and red from all that scrubbing. She'll never catch a husband with hands like that. And her hair," Mira would add with a laugh. "When was the last time she had a proper cut? She looks like she's been living in the woods." These conversations were designed to hurt, to reinforce Vanessa's status as an outsider in what should have been her own home. But despite everything they did to break her spirit, Vanessa held on to something deep inside that they couldn't touch.